This week at Cornerstone, we're going to continue our study in Mark, and we're in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 11, going all the way to verse 33. And Drew Stevenson brings the sermon this week, and I think you're really going to enjoy what Drew brings out of this passage. As we get this passage started, let's remember one of the things that just happened. Remember, we were a little surprised last week. Jesus had again been teaching for a long time, and there was a large crowd, and the scripture tells us that Jesus had compassion on them. He had compassion on the crowd, and he thought that they would be hungry. In fact, he thought if they tried to walk home, some of them wouldn't make it. They would be overcome by hunger, that they needed something to eat. The disciples looked at him and said, well, where in the world would we find enough food to feed this crowd of 4,000? And not long before this, Jesus had just fed 5,000 with a few fish and a few loaves. And the disciples seemed to be puzzled and think, well, how in the world could we feed these 4,000? And so it's kind of against that backdrop that today's passage comes to us. And the Pharisees start by saying they would like to see a sign. They're wanting Jesus to prove something to them. Show us something, Jesus. We want to see something. And Jesus says, this wicked generation, he believes they don't really want to see a sign. They want to keep forcing his hand, and they want to choose to not believe. And then we get to this kind of strange story. The story is a little strange if you pull it out of context, in which Jesus goes to heal a blind man. And when he first heals the blind man, the healing is kind of partial. Jesus rubs his eyes and he opens his eyes, and the man says, well, I can kind of see, but I just see like people walking around like trees. And then Jesus completes the healing, and the man can see completely. And you kind of wonder at that point, so did the first healing not work? Did Jesus kind of miss on the first healing? But really, when we see then what happens in the next story again, where Jesus is talking to the disciples and he asks them about his identity. And Peter says, well, you're the Messiah. And then in just a few breaths later, after saying that he's the Messiah, the one of God, actually God, God's Son, Peter starts to rebuke him. It uses the word rebuke him. Peter starts to question his plan. Peter starts to say to him, I think the way you've got this planned isn't really right. He starts to rebuke Jesus about Jesus' plan as he explains to him his path, which leads through the cross. Jesus' response to Peter is really startling. He says, get behind me, Satan. And so there's this thing where we see in this passage this kind of, people kind of get it. There's a hazy idea like the blind man, and things are starting to come more and more into focus. For Peter, who though he confessed Jesus was the Messiah, he still didn't really completely understand what that meant. And you see that he made some kind of strange ideas about the implication of Jesus being the Messiah when he questioned his very plans. So we get to talk a lot about this idea of a developing view of Jesus as the Messiah and of Jesus' identity at this point in the dialogue through Mark, and then also as we understand Jesus in our own lives. What we'd like you to do is discuss in your connection group this week, how could Peter in one instance declare that Jesus is the Messiah, and then immediately after that start to argue with Jesus about what God's plan should be for the Messiah? Secondly, we'd like you to think about this idea, how Jesus healed the blind man, and it took him a while to completely regain his vision. At first he could see, but everything was blurry. And I really believe that Mark intends for us to understand this as an analogy or as a way how our vision of Jesus the Messiah can be kind of blurry at first. And what I want you to think about is, how has your vision of Jesus the Messiah, or your understanding of Jesus the Messiah, become clearer since you first believed that Jesus was the Messiah? Nextly, we want to talk about and think about our agenda versus God's agenda. To say that Jesus is the Messiah and then argue with Jesus about his agenda and about the way things should be. So really, what's on your agenda? What are the things that you bring to the table that you want to see God do, instead of letting God be God and letting the Messiah be the Messiah? And lastly, and very importantly, if you're not here, what is something that's in your life that's hindering you from coming to Jesus, from believing that Jesus is the Messiah, and then dealing with all the implications of that, and dealing with understanding that God does have a plan? This is a great passage. It's going to be a lot of fun to study, and I know Drew's going to do a great job. So let's talk through this idea of a growing focus and a growing vision and a growing understanding of the identity of Jesus as we study this passage in Mark 8.